We are back at the Apex this week with a fight night headlined by Cannonier and Gregory Rodrigues. Not the most stacked card, but some interesting matchups. We have the Bonfim brothers, some fun Dana White Contender Series guys. I think it'll be a fun card, and so I'm going to be going through my full card predictions in this video. Main card, prelims, picking all the fighters who I think get it done and how they do it. Timestamps are going to be down below. Drop your predictions in the comments. But let's just dive right into the first matchup here. We have the first Bonfim brother, Gabriel Bonfim, taking on Khaos Williams. I think Bonfim is interesting. He was viewed as a pretty elite prospect heading into the UFC, had a solid start to his UFC run. He's 16-1, 3-1 in the UFC, finished 15 of those 16 wins, but his wins in the UFC have been a little bit lower level. Munir Laziz, Trevin Giles, Ange Lusa hasn't really gotten like that signature win over, a top guy, even a very respectable guy who's unranked, hasn't really picked that up yet. In his one loss, he gassed out against Nick Dalby, was a big favorite, kind of just ran out of juice. Dalby put the pace on him, and he ended up getting finished in the second round. He's definitely dangerous with his submission game, has a really, really nasty guillotine. You really don't want to be trying to shoot on him because you're probably going to get locked up in that. On the other side with Khaos Williams, he is purely a striker, so I don't think we're going to have to worry a ton about him, running into that guillotine. He has 2 takedown attempts in his 8 UFC fights. If I was someone who was picking Khaos Williams, I would really not want him to try to get that wrestling going, but he really has not done it consistently at all. He's 6-2 in the UFC, really, really dangerous power. He has 3 UFC KOs in under 1 minute and 30 seconds. Alex Morono, Abdul Razak Al Hassan, Carlston Harris. I mean, he really can nuke you pretty much at any point in the fight. Also dropped Randy Brown, who's a very good striker, had a lot of success in the UFC. I think the question is, does he have the pace to kind of push Bonfim? We saw him really fade in that Nicholas Dalby fight. Can Khaos Williams get the same thing going? Khaos Williams has been very effective at stopping the takedowns. He has an 80% takedown defense. He was only taken down by Michel Pereira in the UFC. And I do think Gabriel Bonfim has better jiu-jitsu than he does wrestling. I think if he can get on top, get in certain positions, his jiu-jitsu is very dangerous, but I don't think he's quite as great as actually getting himself into those spots. So I'm actually going to be going with the underdog here, Khaos Williams. Now, he's looked flat in certain matchups. Sometimes he goes out there, he nukes you early on. Other times can look a little bit underwhelming, but I'm going to pick the underdog here, and I'm going to say that he finishes Gabriel Bonfim in the first round. I think if Khaos Williams is winning this fight, he's probably clipping Bonfim early, or at least, hurting him at some point in the fight. So I'll go round 1 knockout here for the dog. And then moving over to a women's matchup, we have Angela Hill taking on Ketlen Souza. And honestly, Angela Hill has just had such a unique UFC career. She is 12-14, so ton of fights, not the greatest record, but pretty impressive activity, longevity. She's also just had some really bad decision luck. She has 4 split decision losses in the UFC and has a pretty decent argument to have won all of those. In recent years, she's kind of been put up against some of these top prospects, Lupi Godinez, Emily Ducote, Denise Gomes, and she's turned back all 3 of those women, and also probably should have turned back Amanda Lemos in their fight. I know that one was pretty controversial when it went down. She has really impressive cardio. She's going to push a high striking pace, and her recent losses have really just come down to her getting controlled, just, held down on the ground, not being able to get up. Major concern here, though, is she's 40 years old. So when you're getting up there at that age, you're always kind of at the risk of completely falling off. Also, durability could be a concern the older you get. On the other side for Ketlen Souza, she has looked good at 115. She had a clear win over Marnik Mann. Not the best competition, but had a really impressive club and sub win over Yasmin Hauergi. Kind of depressing because I am a pretty decent fan of Hauergi. She clipped her on the feet, jumped right on the back, locked in the rear naked choke on the Sphere card. So big time stage. She came through with a big win as a pretty solid underdog. She throws very powerful looping punches, mixes it up to the body pretty well. Also showed off the submission offense in that Hauergi fight, even though it was only her second submission win out of her 15 total wins. I think the big question here is going to be, how does she deal with Angela Hill pushing the pace? We saw her beat a pretty high-level opponent in Hauergi, but it was in the first round. The Marnik Mann fight, Mann isn't someone who's really going to push the pace, make you uncomfortable. Angela Hill can do it. I think we also have the question of, can Angela Hill take the power shots that Souza is going to be throwing at her at 40 years old? I Think it'll be competitive. I'm going to pick Ketlen Souza by decision. Think she might hurt Angela Hill. Don't think she's going to come up with the finish here, but I will pick Souza by decision. Now moving over to Jared Gordon taking on Kaue Fernandes. Jared Gordon has honestly been on a very unlucky stretch as of late. He had the robbery loss to Paddy Pimblett. Easily should have won that fight. I think one of the craziest scorecards probably in UFC history. Then he was headbutt KO'd by Bobby Green, where I think it was him trying to throw an elbow and he just like lunged with his head, pretty much put Jared Gordon out. Ended up being a no contest, but he was looking really good on the feet against Bobby Green in that fight. So that one ends up, not going his way. Then he had a really impressive KO against Mark Madsen and then lost a pretty bad decision in terms of the scorecards against Nasrat Haqparast. So we're looking at a spot here where he should have probably 3 wins. He's had 2 rough decisions. And then also the fight that looked like he was on his way to winning against Bobby Green obviously did not go his way. He's tough. Pretty durable when he's not fighting like the best of the best, can push a pace, mixes the striking and the grappling pretty well. On the other side with Fernandes, he is a dangerous striker, very good kicks to all 3 levels, leg kicks, body kicks, head kicks, controlled for 9 minutes in his UFC debut, which not great. I think Jared Gordon could potentially capitalize on that. Coming off a round 1 KO versus Muhammad Yahya. Honestly, that was a tough watch. I mean, Yahya just looked like prey out there. He does not look UFC caliber, but Fernandes went in there, still got the W. Gordon has really only definitively lost to the best of the best, going up against studs Charles Oliveira, Grant Dawson, Diego Ferreira, Joaquin Silva. So I think the question in this matchup is, if it goes long, it's probably going to favor Jared Gordon. So does Fernandes nuke him early on? I do think Fernandes has more finishing upside in this matchup. I just don't think so. I think Jared Gordon can kind of survive the early storm, and I'm going to pick Jared Gordon to win this one by decision. Now, moving down to 125, we have Rafael Estevam taking on Jesus Aguilar. I think Estevam is a very interesting player at 125. He is 12-0, 4 knockouts, 3 submission wins, a very, very good grappler. On the Contender Series, he had 2 takedowns, racked up 7 minutes of control time, ended up finishing that one with ground and pound. He won his debut over Charles Johnson. 3 takedowns, almost 10 minutes of control time. Getting a debut win over Charles Johnson is insanely impressive, especially with what we've seen him do as of late. He's gone on a really nice run in his last few fights. On the other side, Aguilar is 3-1 in the UFC. Definitely a submission threat. 7 of his 11 wins are by submission. Has a very impressive guillotine. Talked about it earlier with Gabriel Bonfim. Kind of a similar story here with Jesus Aguilar. The takedown defense is definitely questionable, though, for Aguilar. So even though he is a submission threat, he is also very, very susceptible to getting taken down. He was controlled for 3 minutes on the Contender Series. He was controlled for 4 minutes by Tetsuro Taira, and then also submitted in the first round. And then even in a fight, I believe he won against Mateus Mendoza, he was controlled for 9 minutes in a fight that went to decision. So if Estevam can avoid getting submitted, which is a decent if, I think he's going to be able to rack up some control time, and I think he wins a decision here against Jesus Aguilar. Now going all the way up to the heavyweight division, we have Valter Walker taking on Don'Tale Mayes. This is probably going to be a pretty gross heavyweight fight here. We actually had Don'Tale Mayes promoted to the top 15, even though he is coming off a loss and has a losing record at 4-5 in the UFC. And pretty much every time he has faced real competition, he has lost. Shamil Gaziev, Nascimento twice, Augusto Sakai, Cyril Gane. The UFC record of the fighters he has wins over are 0-3, 0-3, 2-5, and then against a very old Andrei Arlovsky. So at one point, great fighter, but not at the time where Don'Tale Mayes actually faced off. He is very bad off his back, was controlled for 12 minutes by Shamil Gaziev, was controlled for 9 minutes by Augusto Sakai, someone who is, primarily known as a striker, 6.5 minutes when he fought Hamdi Abdullahab. So in terms of Valter Walker, he is going to wrestle. He might not be the most dominant wrestler, but his first UFC fight went 4 for 5 on takedowns, 7 minutes of control time. In his second fight, he had a round 1 finish, went 2 for 3 on takedowns, 4 minutes of control. So I just don't like this matchup for Don'Tale Mayes. Don't think he's great at defending the takedowns. Do not think he's great at getting back up, getting to his feet. So neither guy, I think, is overly impressive at heavyweight. It's a gross division. Probably not going to be the most exciting fight, but I think Valter Walker gets it done. The question is just going to be, does he find the finish or does he win by decision? I'm going to pick him by decision. Mays, even when he has been getting controlled, has still been fairly durable in terms of getting to the bell. So I'll pick Valter Walker by decision. Now going back down to, I think, bantamweight here, we have Vince Morales taking on Elijah Smith. So this is Morales' second stint in the UFC. He has a combined UFC record of 3-6, and he's just really struggled with higher level competition. Like you even see when he left the UFC, put together a really nice win streak, even some decent names outside the UFC, but then he comes back and it's just right back to, falling to some of this better comp. Morales doesn't really have one area that he can truly bank on. Like he can't consistently get his grappling going. He is pretty consistently getting outstruck by plus strikers. He does have a lot of experience, way more than Elijah Smith. He's 34 years old, has 24 pro fights. Elijah Smith is only 22 with a 7-1 record, and he made his pro debut in 2022. So he is definitely still very raw as a prospect, but I do think he has some very fun tools in this weight class. He's going to push a solid pace, has a pretty big frame for 135. I think he mixes up his striking well between straight and looping punches. He is very explosive, also has the ability to wrestle. I do think he can be a little bit reckless. Even though he pushes a hard pace, sometimes he can be a little bit tired. Not because he has bad cardio, but he's just throwing so much into his punches, doing so much. So I'm going to pick Elijah Smith by decision. I do just hope that he kind of paces himself here, because this could turn into one of those matchups where you have the young guy who, goes out, throws everything at the veteran, and then the veteran kind of weathers the storm and closes well. I'm still going to pick Elijah Smith, but just hope he manages the gas tank. We're going to be sticking around in the bantamweight division, but going over to the women's side with Julia Avila taking on Jacqueline Cavalcanti. There's just an extreme difference in activity here. Cavalcanti debuted in September of 2023. She's 3-0 in the UFC. 2 split decisions, which might look sketchy, but neither of those should have been splits. I think she pretty clearly won both those matchups. She is a striker, pretty defensively responsible, not going to put herself in a ton of danger. Very good takedown defense so far in her UFC career. Julia Avila's last fight was December of 2023, where she was submitted by Miesha Tate. She fought 2 times in 2020, then once in 2021, did not fight in 2022, and then 1 fight in 2023. She has finished 2 of her 3 UFC wins, but those women are both 2-6 in the UFC, so quality of competition not really there. I just think Cavalcanti is going to be able to keep this one standing. The layoff for Avila is not great. I believe she's 36, kind of getting up there in age a little bit here. So I'm going to go Cavalcanti by decision. I think she gets it done like she has in her first 3 UFC fights. Then a pretty interesting grappling matchup. We have Rodolfo Vieira taking on Andre Petroski. This is pretty much like very solid wrestler in Petroski versus Rodolfo Vieira, who is a very credentialed jiu-jitsu practitioner, has a great resume there. So Vieira is 5-2 in the UFC. All 5 wins are by submission. He has landed a takedown in 6 of his 7 fights. On the other side with Petroski, he has a 7-2 UFC record. I know he had a pretty decent UFC record. I honestly didn't think it was that impressive. And then you kind of dig into the competition. He has faced very, very weak comp. Honestly, a miracle that the competition has been so weak, given the fact that he's pretty consistently going out and winning fights. His wins have a combined record of 19-29, and Mearshart is the only win he has who actually has a winning record in the UFC. So not great. His losses have been to Michel Pereira and Jacob Malkoun. That Malkoun fight was one of the weirdest knockouts I've ever seen. I think Petroski shot in for a takedown and then hit his head on Malkoun's hip bone and pretty much rocked himself and knocked himself out. Very odd situation. Don't think I'd ever seen that before. But Petroski is pretty solid wrestling. If he's striking, he can be powerful, but he really loads and kind of tenses up on the feet, which can also lead to some questionable cardio because he's just throwing so much into his shots. I don't really love Petroski on the feet. I trust Vieira to out-grapple him. I think really outside of the Chris Curtis fight, he's been able to get his grappling going. Even in the Anthony Fluffy Hernandez matchup, he looked good early on. He just completely gassed, and Fluffy obviously has an insane gas tank. So Chris Curtis has had very solid takedown defense. I think Vieira is going to have the better cardio in this matchup. Petroski can kind of tend to fade, especially if he's not dictating his own pace. I think Vieira gets it done by submission here. Now, sticking around at 185, we have Edmen Shahbazyan taking on Dylan Budka. Honestly, this Shahbazyan kind of career arc has been pretty unfortunate. He started off 11-0, 4-0 in the UFC, 10 of his 11 wins were finishes. Since then, he has gone 2-5 in the UFC. He has been finished in 4 of those 5 fights. He is just really stalled against like legit top 15 quality competition. First loss was against Derek Brunson in 2020. He had 2 losses in 2021 to Jack Hermansson and Nasruddin Imavov. Anthony Fluffy Hernandez in 2023. And then 2024, the worst one of them all was a submission loss to Gerald Meerschaert. He just has some real red flags. His cardio has just never been there. Like, it seems like he's just one of those dudes that's never going to have great cardio. He is going to fade if he does not get an early finish, especially if the opponent is going to push a wrestling-heavy game plan. The ground game just is consistently failing him. And then also just the fight IQ. If you're someone you know you don't have that cardio and you're going against someone who can kind of exploit you on the ground, like when you're fighting Gerald Meerschaert, you can't blow all your energy trying to look for a finish in round 2 when you know if you don't get it, you're just going to be cooked and he's going to submit you. So kind of a lot of red flags here for Edmen Shahbazyan. But on the other side, I just don't think Dylan Budka is that great. He's 7-4. 0-2 in the UFC. He's not really a finisher. His 3 finishes and his 7 wins were against people with records of 2-10, 2-4, 4-1. Now, on paper, in terms of his style, he is a wrestler. He is someone who could potentially push the pace. I just think this is a very extreme difference in terms of their skill levels. So I'm going to go with Edmen Shahbazyan by round 1 knockout. You hope he can kind of get it going, but it's just not great that he's consistently losing to like the same type of opponents, even 4 years, 5 years later. Like with the Brunson fight, you could still say, all right, he's young, has a lot of time to grow. He still is young, but it just doesn't seem like he's making the necessary improvements. I still think he wins this one by first round knockout, but hopefully he can start to build something. Then we're going to have Jose Delgado taking on Conor Matthews. Delgado is really fun to watch. He is 8-1. 4 KOs, 4 submission wins. He pushes a pace, throws in combination, dangerous kicks, times his takedowns really well. Had a nasty knee knockout on the Contender Series. I do think he can be a little bit over-aggressive, put himself in some bad spots, kind of open himself up to getting hit, but it's kind of what makes him fun to watch. Conor Matthews was KO'd in his UFC debut, has one of the weakest pre-UFC records I've ever seen. His first 5 opponents were 0-7, 1-8, 2-1, look at that winning record, 15-97, and then 1-2. In his first shot on the Contender Series, he was thoroughly beaten by Francis Marshall. He did win his second shot on the Contender Series, used his wrestling, 7 takedowns, 5 minutes of control time. 5 of his 7 wins are by submission. I just think Delgado is so much more dangerous. He is a good grappler. I don't think he's going to get out-grappled or submitted by Conor Matthews, and I think he has a significant edge on the feet. So I'm going to go with Jose Delgado by round 2 knockout. I do think he finds the finish in this matchup. Now we're going to have the second Bonfim brother, Ismael Bonfim, taking on Nazim Sadykhov. I think this is going to be a competitive fight. I think both these guys are very well-rounded. Bonfim, I'd say, is primarily a striker, but can mix in the wrestling. Probably most well known for his nasty flying knee knockout against Terrence McKinney. I mean, just completely stifled McKinney's offense. Someone who comes out super dangerous early on, never seemed like he was in danger, ended up finding that great finish. And then Nazim Sadykhov is someone who just brings the violence in his matchups. He is going to thrive in a dogfight, mixes it up very well. He's powerful on the feet, throws big kicks, but can also definitely grapple. I think it's going to be close. I think Sadykhov kind of mixing it up, making it a like dirty, grimy fight, getting in the clinch, maybe landing some takedowns. I think Sadykhov wins a very close decision. Would also not be shocked if Bonfim picked up the W. We have arrived at the co-main event with Kattar taking on Youssef Zalal, and these are just 2 guys who are going in 2 very, very different directions in their career. Let's flash back to August of 2022. Youssef Zalal had just drew a short notice bantamweight against Damon Blackshear, so not a great sign. Has a draw. At that point, he was 0-3-1 in his last 4, was cut from the UFC. Cavalcanti had just headlined a main event against Josh Emmett. Many people thought he won, which could have set him up for a potential title shot. So you had someone who was on a very rough stretch, 0-3-1 in their last 4 fights, getting cut from the UFC. On the other side, Cavalcanti main eventing against a top contender and very competitive in that matchup. Youssef Zalal then went on to go 3-1 with 3 finishes on the regional scene, got back in the UFC, and has gone 3-0 since, finishing all 3 of his opponents, Jack Shore, Jarno Aarons, and Billy Q. So pretty decent competition, especially the Billy Q, Jack Shore matchups. Zalal is solid on the feet, definitely can hold his own, but where he definitely separates is he is very, very dangerous on the ground. Then for the other side for Kattar, unfortunately, it does seem like he is just trending way down. He blew out his knee in a main event against Arnold Allen in October of 2022. Then he returned April 24 against Aljo, but just looked very flat, was taken down 8 times, controlled for 11 minutes, landed 8 total significant strikes. He's already kind of getting up there in age at 36. It definitely seemed like after the knee injury, his athleticism was kind of zapped. Never really had the best finishing upside against elite competition, and also has real grappling questions here. So for me, it's tough to pick Kattar. It would be cool to see him, kind of return to form, really give Youssef Zalal a dogfight here. But I'm going to go with Zalal by decision. I just don't see how we look at their recent fights and pick against him. I'm going to pick Zalal by decision. Do think Kattar is, decent submission defense. We saw Aljo having some bad positions, was able to survive, but I do think Youssef Zalal gets it done. And then we are here at the main event, Cannonier taking on Gregory RoboCop Rodrigues. This kind of feels like a final stand opportunity for Cannonier. He has lost back-to-back fights to Nasruddin Imavov and Kyle Bohalio. Now, there's really no shame in those losses. I mean, those are both guys that are probably going to fight for the title within the next year or two, but he's 40 years old, took some damage, was hurt pretty badly in both those matchups. I still think that Cannonier is capable of winning rounds against top competition. He can mix in his wrestling. The cardio, miraculously is still there. May even be better than it was 3-4 years ago. Obviously has a ton of experience. His last 5 fights have been 5 rounds, and 4 of those went the distance. And the one that didn't, I believe, ended in the 4th round against Imavov. On the other side with Gregory Rodrigues, he is 7-2 in the UFC. One of his losses was a split decision, somewhat controversial, could very easily be 8-1. He is very, very powerful on the feet, has fight-ending power. I think underrated wrestling. It's something that he doesn't go to a lot. He did use in his last fight against Christian Leroy Duncan. He kind of fell in love with the hands, but definitely someone who can mix it up. I will say he is someone who can be clipped and hurt. In certain matchups, it seems like he can take an insane amount of damage. You look at that Chidi and Jokuani fight, looked like he should have been finished multiple times. In other fights, he can get hurt, can get finished. In his 5 losses, 3 of them have come from him getting knocked out. I believe he got knocked out by a dude debuting. The name is slipping right now, but got nuked very early on. I think it was the one of the cards in Brazil. Also kind of a red flag here. He has 0 5-round experience, but he is kind of on the rise. 3 straight wins. Even though he looks a lot older than this, he's only 32 years old, so still decently young in the middleweight division. I'm going to go with the younger guy here in RoboCop. I think the durability concerns are real for Cannonier. Has, been seriously hurt in his last couple of fights. RoboCop is going to bring the power. Even though Cannonier's cardio has been decent, I don't think he's really ever been someone who's truly going to weaponize it. So I don't think he's going to make Rodrigues super uncomfortable. I think RoboCop probably has more grappling upside here. And then the power, I just keep coming back to the power. I think RoboCop is going to finish Cannonier. I'm going to pick RoboCop round 2 knockout. Cannonier's had a great career. If he can turn back the clock here, that would be fun to see. But I think this division is going to have some overhaul in the next, year or so. And I think Rodrigues is going to start climbing the ranks. So that is going to wrap it up for my full card predictions. Let me hear your thoughts down below. Drop your predictions for the main cards. You agree, disagree? Let me hear it. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.